The cold wind cut through Jacob Whitaker's jacket, biting at his exposed skin as he leaned against the rusted fence of the livestock auction lot. The smell of stale hay and animal sweat lingered in the air, mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of oil and dust. His eyes scanned the pens one by one, each filled with animals that seemed to bear the weight of their own forgotten lives. Jacob felt a certain connection to them. Each creature here was discarded, unwanted, just like him. At 17, Jacob should have been gearing up for a future as a motocross star. He'd been the best in his class, taking risks on the track that earned him a reputation, but that had been before the accident, the one that took his right arm and shattered his sense of self. Now, he was just a shell of who he used to be. He spent his days holed up in his room, avoiding the people who looked at him with pity. And then there was his cousin, Braden, who made sure to remind him of everything he wasn't at. "You're just a freak now, huh?" Braden would sneer, often tossing in a few more insults for good measure. It was easier to stay quiet than to fight back. Jacob was tired of fighting. He'd lost too much. But today, something felt different. His aunt had dragged him along to the auction, claiming it would be good for him to get out of the house. She hadn't known that the thought of being surrounded by people again made his chest tighten, but he'd agreed anyway. As they walked through the lot, his aunt chattering away about things Jacob didn't care about, he kept his head down, focusing on the ground beneath his boots. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the auction lot was a stallion, his black coat matted and scarred. The horse was trembling, his body cowering in the corner of the pen, his head lowered, as if he'd given up. Jacob's breath caught in his throat, his heart thumping louder than the clamor around him. He wasn't sure what drew him to the horse. Maybe it was the way he seemed to be hiding from the world, just like Jacob did. Or maybe it was the deep, haunting scars that marred the stallion's body, wounds that spoke of a past too painful to bear. The auctioneer, an older man with a weathered face, stepped forward, pointing at the horse. "You don't want that one," he said gruffly. "He's busted up, been whipped, abused. You're better off buying something else." Jacob didn't need to hear more. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an overwhelming need to rescue this horse. The world might have given up on him, but Jacob wasn't willing to do the same to Shadow, as he decided to call him in his mind. "Can I buy him?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow. "What, that one? You sure about that, kid? That horse'll never be good for anything but glue?" Jacob swallowed hard. He didn't have money to spare, not with his parents gone and the small amount he got from working odd jobs barely enough to cover his own needs. But there was something inside of him that wouldn't let go of this feeling, this need to save the horse. "I'll trade this," Jacob said, pulling out his old gaming console from his backpack and holding it up. It wasn't worth much, but it was all he had of value. The auctioneer chuckled, shaking his head. "You're trading a console for a broken-down horse? Kid, you're out of your mind." But Jacob didn't care. He had to do this. He felt a surge of determination that he hadn't felt in months. Shadow wasn't just a horse. He was a symbol. A symbol of survival, of fighting when everything seemed lost. Without a second thought, Jacob handed over the console, and the deal was done. As the auctioneer led Shadow toward the back of the lot, Jacob followed, his steps steady, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. He didn't know what he was going to do with the horse, but he knew he couldn't leave him behind, not when the horse's broken spirit mirrored his own. When Jacob reached the stall, where Shadow was to be kept, he felt a tightness in his chest. The stallion was skittish, flinching at the slightest movement. Jacob stood outside the pen, unsure of how to approach. "Hey," he whispered, trying to calm the horse. "It's okay. You're not alone anymore." For a long moment, the stallion didn't react. But then, slowly, he lifted his head, his swollen eyes squinting toward Jacob. It was as if the horse was trying to decide if he could trust him. Jacob stood there, letting the silence stretch between them, feeling a strange connection growing. It was the same feeling he used to have when he was on the track. when everything in the world fell away and there was just him and the bike. Only this time, it wasn't a bike, it was a horse. "I'm not leaving you," Jacob muttered, more to himself than to the horse. "You're not alone anymore." As the wind howled around them, Jacob made a promise to the horse and to himself that he would not give up. Not on Shadow, not on himself. The days that followed were a blur of silence and patience. Jacob spent every spare moment with Shadow, even though the horse didn't seem to notice his presence at first. His aunt, though initially skeptical of the whole endeavor, didn't protest too much. After all, Jacob was quiet, withdrawn, and seemed content to be near the horse. It was a welcome change from the boy who barely spoke, even to her. Jacob sat outside Shadow's pen every morning and evening, his back leaning against the wooden fence, his eyes never straying from the dark form of the horse inside. The first few days, Shadow didn't even seem to acknowledge Jacob's presence. The stallion remained huddled in the corner, his body tense, as though expecting some form of punishment. His coat was rough and matted, a testament to the neglect he had endured. There were the deep scars, too, whip marks that twisted and marred his body, and the bloodshot eye that refused to open fully. He was a living, breathing reminder of everything that had been broken. But Jacob saw something in him that no one else did. Potential. He wasn't just a waste of space. As the auctioneer had said, he was a creature who had been hurt, just like Jacob, but who still had the strength to survive. And that, in itself, was something to fight for. Jacob would often talk to him, even though Shadow didn't respond. "You're not alone anymore," he'd say softly, his voice steady, though his heart sometimes ached with the weight of his own words. "I know what it's like to feel like you're broken, but we're going to fix this together." It felt strange at first, talking to a horse, but it was the only way Jacob knew how to connect. He didn't have the words to explain himself to people. He didn't know how to tell them that he felt like half a person, that he missed the boy he used to be. But with Shadow, it was different. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was an understanding, an unspoken promise that they both would heal. Each day, Jacob tried something new. He would sit outside the pen and read aloud, his voice low and steady, filling the empty air with the sound of words. He read everything from books his aunt had bought him to old magazines he found in the attic, even comic books he used to love before the accident. Sometimes he would hum quietly to himself, then, and while Shadow never seemed to react, Jacob could feel the change. The horse's rigid stance seemed to loosen a little each day, his eyes flicking toward Jacob for just a second longer than the day before. On the fourth day, Jacob dared to take it a step further. He opened the gate to the pen, stepping cautiously inside. The air inside was thick with the smell of hay and dust, and for a moment Jacob felt his heart race. What if Shadow didn't want him there? What if the horse reacted badly, lashed out in fear? But Jacob had to try. He took a deep breath, steadying his pulse, and reached his hand out toward the horse. Shadow, as expected, shrank back, his eyes wide with fear. The scarred stallion backed into the corner of the pen, his body trembling as if expecting pain. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jacob whispered, though his voice trembled slightly with the emotion that rose in his chest. "I promise." Jacob stayed where he was, crouched down, his arm outstretched but not pushing, not demanding. He simply waited. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours as they stood there in the dim light. Shadow's breathing slowed, and after what felt like an eternity, he took a hesitant step forward. His nose twitched, sniffing the air between them. Jacob's heart swelled. It was small, but it was progress. He didn't try to touch Shadow that day. Instead, he just stood there, the two of them sharing the quiet space. For the first time since the accident, Jacob didn't feel like an outsider in his own life. It wasn't about his missing arm. It wasn't about the way people looked at him differently. Here, in the barn, with Shadow, he was simply Jacob, a boy with a broken past and a horse who was still healing. That night, As Jacob sat on the fence outside the pen, he couldn't help but smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He could feel a bond beginning to form, fragile as it was. In the silence, Jacob whispered again, this time with more conviction. "We're gonna make it, buddy, together." But not everyone was as convinced as Jacob was. The next morning, as Jacob was brushing hay off the floor of the barn, Braden sauntered in, his boots heavy on the ground, his eyes full of that familiar smugness. The 19-year-old was a cocky farmhand with a sarcastic streak that never seemed to let up, especially when it came to Jacob. "What's this, Disney boy? You bonding with your new pet?" Braden scoffed, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorway. "That horse is a freak, just like you. You really think you're going to make something out of that? Hilarious." Jacob's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Braden's insults were nothing new. He'd been hearing them for years, ever since the accident. But there was something different now. For the first time, Jacob felt a flicker of something inside him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It was determination. "I'm not giving up on him," Jacob said quietly, meeting Braden's mocking gaze with a steady one of his own. Braden snorted. "Good luck with that. You know, if it were up to me, I'd send that thing to the glue factory. Waste of space." Jacob didn't flinch. He just shook his head, his eyes still fixed on Shadow, who stood quietly in the corner of the pen. "I'll prove you wrong," Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. "I won't give up on him." And with that, Braden walked out, laughing under his breath, leaving Jacob alone with his thoughts, and with Shadow, who seemed to be watching him more closely now, as though sensing that Jacob's words were more than just promises. They were a commitment. The journey had only just begun. Jacob knew the barn well, its creaky wooden beams, the faint smell of hay, the worn-down tools scattered in the corners. Yet, for the first time in weeks, he felt a strange sense of peace here, a quiet that was unlike anything he had felt before. He had come to terms with the silence, with the steady rhythm of the days. In those moments, it was just him and Shadow, both of them healing in their own way. But not everyone saw it the way Jacob did. It didn't take long for Braden to start making his usual rounds again, walking the property with his loud, cocky swagger. Braden had been Jacob's cousin for as long as he could remember, and the two had never seen eye to eye. While Jacob was quiet and introspective, Braden was loud and boisterous, always needing to be the center of attention, always reminding Jacob of everything he'd lost. Braden wasn't exactly thrilled that Jacob was spending all his time in the barn, tending to Shadow. He'd been mocking Jacob's efforts from the start, but today it felt different, more pointed. Braden didn't just make fun of Jacob anymore. He was aiming for something deeper, something that felt like an attack on Jacob's very soul. It was early afternoon, and Braden showed up at the barn again. Jacob was sitting on the edge of the hayloft, watching Shadow graze in the paddock below. It wasn't a perfect bond yet, but every time he watched the horse move more confidently, Jacob's heart swelled. Shadow was healing. Jacob was healing. But Braden's voice broke through the quiet, carrying that familiar mocking tone. "Well, well," Braden called up to Jacob, his voice echoing through the barn. "Look at you, playing farm boy with your new friend." He paused, scanning Jacob's face with a smirk. "You really think this horse is going to make you feel whole again? You're just as broken as it is." Jacob's stomach tightened at the words. He didn't respond immediately, not wanting to give Braden the satisfaction of seeing him upset. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on Shadow, watching as the horse turned his head toward him, ears flicking back. The connection felt stronger than ever, and for a moment, Jacob let himself believe that maybe Braden was wrong. Maybe Shadow wasn't just a waste of space. Maybe he was something more, a reflection of Jacob's own journey. "Hey, Disney boy," Braden continued, leaning against the barn door with his arms crossed. "What's next? You gonna start riding him around? You think you're gonna be the next cowboy? The horse can barely walk, and you can't even hold a freaking shovel with one hand." Jacob gritted his teeth, but said nothing. Braden had always been quick to point out Jacob's shortcomings, his missing arm a constant reminder of what Jacob could never do again. But this time, Jacob wasn't going to let Braden get under his skin. "I'm just trying to help him," Jacob said, evenly, his voice calm but firm. "I know what it feels like to be discarded. You wouldn't understand." Braden laughed, shaking his head. "I understand just fine. You're wasting your time, Jacob. That horse is a wreck. You're a wreck. Why don't you just face it? You'll never be the same again. You'll never be the guy you used to be, and neither will that thing." Jacob's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. He wanted to lash out, wanted to scream at Braden for all the times he had belittled him, for all the times he had been made to feel like he wasn't enough. But instead, Jacob closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Maybe I'm not the same person I used to be," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. "But that doesn't mean I can't still be something. And neither can Shadow." The words hung in the air, heavy with a weight Jacob hadn't intended to carry. Braden's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jacob, taking in the quiet strength that now emanated from him. Braden let out a frustrated sigh, pushing off the barn door. "Whatever, man," he muttered. "But I bet you can't even get that horse to jump over a single hurdle. I mean, hell, if you can't even get him to walk right, what makes you think he'll be able to do that?" Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly. The challenge was clear, and for a moment, doubt crept in. He hadn't even begun training Shadow in that way. But something inside him stirred, something deep and determined. "I'll take you up on that," Jacob said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "If I can get Shadow to jump a hurdle, you'll leave him alone. You won't try to I'll home him or make fun of us again." Braden raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Oh, this should be good," he said with a smirk. "All right, I'll make a bet with you. If you can get that horse to jump over a hurdle, I'll leave him alone. But if you can't, I get to take him to the glue factory myself. Deal?" Jacob's heart thudded in his chest. The words burned into him, but he wasn't going to back down now. He had to prove something, not just to Braden, but to himself. "Deal," Jacob said firmly, looking Braden in the eye. "You're on?" Braden chuckled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is going to be a riot. Good luck, Disney boy. You're going to need it." With that, Braden turned on his heel and walked out of the barn, leaving Jacob standing in the silence, his heart racing. The challenge had been set, and Jacob knew it wasn't just about the hurdle anymore. It was about proving to Braden and to himself that he was capable of something more, that he wasn't broken, that he and Shadow could still rise above the expectations that everyone else had placed on them. As Jacob looked down at the scarred stallion, his resolve only grew stronger. He would prove them wrong. He would train Shadow. He would teach him to trust again, and together they would show the world that broken things could still be whole. 1 minute, the sky had been a soft shade of blue, the clouds lazily drifting across the horizon. The next, the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind howled with a fury that rattled the windows of the barn. Jacob looked up from the workbench where he'd been sorting through the old tack, his heart beating a little faster. The sound of the wind was unsettling, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. Shadow was still in the paddock, grazing quietly, his body framed by the darkening sky. Jacob didn't think much of it at first. After all, Shadow had been growing stronger with each passing day. He was eating better, his coat had started to shine, and his movements were less stiff. But as the wind picked up, Jacob noticed something. Shadow's ears flicked nervously, his head jerking toward the barn. The horse's eyes were wide, his nostrils flaring as the storm approached. Jacob felt a sharp pang in his chest, a sudden understanding dawning on him. Shadow had been through so much. Violence, abuse, and neglect. Loud noises, sudden movements, anything that reminded him of those days would send the stallion into a panic. The storm wasn't just a change in the weather to him, it was a trigger, a reminder of all the pain Shadow had endured. The first clap of thunder rattled the barn like a cannon blast. Shadow's whole body jerked, and before Jacob could react, the horse bolted. His hooves thundered against the ground as he tried to escape, panic evident in every twitch of his muscles. Jacob's heart stopped. His instinct was to run, to hide, to get away from the chaos, but something inside him wouldn't let him. He wasn't going to let Shadow go through this alone. "Shadow!" Jacob shouted, but the storm's roar swallowed his voice. The stallion tore around the paddock, his hooves slipping in the mud as he raced in circles, panicked and desperate. Jacob knew the horse wasn't just running from the storm. He was running from the memories that haunted him, from the fear of being hurt again. The barn doors banged open with the force of the wind, and Jacob's blood ran cold. He had to get to Shadow. He couldn't let the horse hurt himself. Without thinking, Jacob rushed toward the paddock, the wind biting at his face. The rain was coming down in sheets now, stinging his skin, but he kept his eyes locked on Shadow, who was now thrashing near the far corner of the field. "Shadow! Calm down! It's okay," Jacob called, his voice barely audible over the storm. But Shadow wasn't listening. The horse's eyes were wild with terror, and with every step Jacob could see how deeply ingrained the fear was. He was too far away, too close to panic himself. Then, as the wind howled louder and another flash of lightning split the sky, Shadow turned, his body rearing back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was like he had been caught in a trap, a circle of fear that he couldn't escape. Jacob's breath caught in his chest as he closed the distance. He knew the horse was too scared to recognize him, too frightened to trust anyone. But Jacob wasn't going to leave. He couldn't. In one desperate move, Jacob threw open the gate to the paddock and rushed toward the horse. He barely noticed the sharp sting of rain against his skin as he reached out, speaking softly through his breaths. "It's okay, Shadow. I'm here." The stallion froze for a brief moment, and Jacob's heart skipped a beat. But it wasn't enough. Shadow was too far gone in his fear to hear the calmness in Jacob's voice. The horse lunged forward again, but this time Jacob was ready. He ran straight toward him, closing the distance, pushing through the fear that gripped his chest. Without thinking, Jacob moved toward Shadow's flank, reaching out and gently placing his hand on the horse's trembling body. The horse flinched, but Jacob held steady, his fingers digging into the coarse muscle, his breath coming in shaky bursts. "I know what it's like," Jacob said, his voice steady, despite the storm. "I know what it's like to be scared of loud things, too." The words were simple, but the were true. Jacob's heart was pounding, his mind racing with all the memories of the accident, of the crash that had stolen his arm and made him a different person. He'd been so afraid of the world after it happened, afraid of being judged, of being seen as weak. But now, standing in the storm with Shadow, he realized something. They weren't so different after all. Both of them had been hurt. Both of them were carrying scars. Jacob leaned in, letting his forehead rest against Shadow's drenched flank. The rain soaked through his shirt, but he didn't care. This moment was bigger than that. Shadow's breathing started to slow, just a little. His body was still trembling, but he didn't pull away. Jacob's hand remained on the horse's side, his fingers now tracing the rough fur, calming himself just as much as he was calming the horse. "I'm not going to let you go," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We're in this together." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain and the wind and the steady thump of Shadow's heart. Slowly, as if the horse could sense that Jacob wasn't going to leave him, Shadow began to relax, his muscles releasing their tension, his body no longer jerking with panic. Jacob stayed there, his hand gently resting on Shadow's flank, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like an eternity before the storm finally began to ease, the thunder fading into the distance. The rain softened and the winds howling grew quieter. But Jacob didn't move. He couldn't leave the horse, not yet. As the storm finally passed, leaving only the soft patter of raindrops against the ground, Jacob slowly pulled away from the horse, looking up at Shadow's face. The stallion's eyes, though still wide, seemed a little less frantic. He had stopped shaking. Jacob smiled, relief flooding his chest. The worst was over. "See?" Jacob whispered, his voice soft. "I told you. You're not alone." It was in that moment, standing there in the remnants of the storm, that Jacob knew. No matter how broken they both were, they could still heal. They had each other now, and that was enough. The days following the storm were quiet, but they weren't calm. It was as if both Jacob and Shadow were feeling the weight of what they had just experienced, each processing the storm in their own way. The horse seemed quieter now, almost more withdrawn than before, but Jacob could feel a shift. Something had changed between them during that chaotic night, and it wasn't just the storm. It was the moment when he reached out to Shadow, not just as a caretaker, but as someone who understood what it felt like to be broken. Jacob spent the next few mornings with the horse, quietly watching him from the fence, not pushing. He had learned by now that Shadow didn't need to be rushed, just like Jacob didn't need to be rushed. Time was their ally, even if it felt slow, even if it was frustrating. Every day, Jacob would sit and talk to him, reading out loud from one of his books. Even if Shadow never seemed to listen, it was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, with patience. But Jacob wasn't sure what else to do. He had been so focused on gaining Shadow's trust that he had forgotten something important. The next step. They had come so far, and now it was time to take the next leap. He wasn't sure if Shadow was ready, but Jacob had to believe that he was. One morning, Jacob stood by the paddock, looking out at the wide expanse of land beyond the barn. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft light over everything, and Jacob felt a surge of resolve. He walked over to the gate and gently opened it. Stepping inside, Shadow was grazing, his back to Jacob, but Jacob didn't hesitate. He moved toward him slowly, keeping his movements calm and controlled. No sudden gestures, no noise. "Hey, Shadow," Jacob murmured, holding out his hand. "Come on, buddy. Let's try this again." Shadow's ears flicked, his eyes narrowing slightly. But Jacob could see it in the horse's body language. He was more aware of Jacob now, more present. For the first time in a while, Shadow didn't turn away in fear. He just watched Jacob, and Jacob could see a glimmer of something in his eyes. It wasn't trust yet, not fully, but it was something close. Jacob took another step forward, this time letting his hand hover near the horse's neck. Shadow didn't pull back. Instead, he took a step forward, his nose touching Jacob's hand cautiously. It was as if he was testing Jacob, testing whether he could be trusted. Jacob's heart leapt in his chest. The breakthrough was small, but it was real. He stayed still for a moment, allowing Shadow to make the next move. And then, with a soft breath, Jacob reached out and gently placed his hand on the horse's shoulder. Shadow flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. Jacob's heart thudded loudly in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "You're doing good," Jacob whispered, his voice low and soothing. "We're getting there. Together." Slowly, Jacob guided Shadow to the center of the paddock. The horse moved tentatively, but there was something different in his movements now. It wasn't the panicked, erratic pace from before. It was a cautious calmness, like the horse was learning to trust his own body again. When they reached the center of the paddock, Jacob stopped, his hand still resting on Shadow's shoulder. He could feel the tension in the horse's muscles, but it was nothing like it had been before. The storm wasn't just a physical thing anymore. It had washed away some of the deeper fears, too. Shadow was no longer running from his past. He was learning to live with it, to move past it. "Ready for the next step?" Jacob asked, though he wasn't sure who he was really asking. It wasn't about the hurdle, not yet. It was about taking the next step. Moving forward, no matter how small. With a deep breath, Jacob stepped back, pulling gently on the lead rope. Shadow flinched, but didn't pull away. Jacob had never been sure how to train a horse. But he knew this much. The key wasn't force. It was trust. It was patience. So he kept his movements calm, never pushing too hard, always waiting for the horse to meet him halfway. It took a few tries, but eventually Shadow moved with him, following the steady pull of the rope. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but for the first time, Jacob saw something in the horse's eyes that he hadn't seen before: understanding. The bond between them had shifted, deepened. Jacob could feel the subtle change, the quiet recognition that they weren't so different after all. When they finally came to a stop, Jacob stood still for a moment, breathing in the warm morning air. Shadow stood beside him, his head lowered, in a quiet, peaceful acceptance. There was still work to be done, but for now, in that moment, Jacob couldn't help but smile. They had made it. Just then, Braden's voice cut through the quiet, and Jacob's smile faltered for a moment. He turned to see his cousin standing at the fence, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. "Well, well, look at that. The one-armed wonder finally got his horse to walk in a straight line," Braden said with a laugh. "Impressive." Jacob didn't rise to the bait. He just looked at Braden, meeting his gaze with calm resolve. "It's not about impressing you, Braden," Jacob said quietly. "It's about doing something that matters." Braden scoffed, shaking his head. "You really think that horse is going to jump a hurdle? You're dreaming, man." Jacob didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply turned back to Shadow, gently guiding him toward the makeshift training area Jacob had set up the day before, a small hurdle made of old wooden poles. He had spent hours setting it up, not knowing if Shadow would even make it that far. But now, with the horse walking beside him, Jacob felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just belief in the horse. It was belief in himself. "I'm not dreaming," Jacob said under his breath, mostly to himself. "We're both just getting started." As the sun rose higher in the sky, Jacob set his eyes on the small hurdle ahead. The challenge was on, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was fighting alone. He had Shadow beside him, and that was enough to keep going. Jacob stood at the edge of the makeshift arena, his hand loosely gripping the lead rope that connected him to Shadow. The morning air was crisp, and the sun was shining down, casting long shadows across the yard. The small hurdle, constructed from old wooden poles, stood in front of them like an obstacle to be conquered. It was no grand structure, but to Jacob it represented something far more important, something personal. It was a symbol of his commitment, of how far he and Shadow had come since that first stormy night when fear had threatened to pull them both under. Today was the day that Braden had taunted him about. The day Jacob would either prove him wrong or lose everything. Braden stood by the fence, arms crossed, his usual smirk plastered across his face. He had been watching Jacob and Shadow all morning, waiting for the moment when this would fall apart. Braden didn't believe in second chances. He didn't believe in broken things being fixed. And he definitely didn't believe that Jacob, with only one arm and a scarred past, could turn a broken horse into something that could jump. Jacob had tried to ignore Braden's words. But every time his cousin spoke, it felt like a weight pressing on his chest. He had spent years being made to feel like he wasn't enough. By Braden, by the world, by himself. But today was different. Today, he wasn't doing this for anyone but himself and Shadow. No one else could understand the connection they had. No one else had been there in the storm, feeling the fear and the hope of reaching out to a creature that didn't know if it could trust again. "Come on, Disney boy," Braden called out, his voice laced with mockery. "Let's see if your horse can actually do something useful. Or are you just wasting everyone's time?" Jacob's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Braden see him falter. He had faced worse. He had been told he was less than human, that he wasn't good enough after the accident. And yet, here he was, standing with Shadow by his side, ready to prove them all wrong. He wasn't going to let Braden or anyone else tear down what he had worked so hard to build. Shadow, Jacob murmured, looking into the horse's eyes. There was still a flicker of uncertainty in the stallion's gaze, but it was different now. Shadow was no longer the frantic, fearful horse who had bolted in every direction at the first sign of danger. No, this horse had come a long way. He was learning to trust. He was learning to believe. Jacob nodded, giving the lead rope a gentle pull. Shadow took a tentative step forward, his hooves scraping the dirt beneath him. Jacob's heart raced, but he kept his breathing steady, his focus on the task at hand. He didn't need perfection. He didn't even need the horse to clear the hurdle flawlessly. He just needed to see progress. He needed to see that both of them could push through their fears, that they could rise above everything they had been through. The first attempt was clumsy. As they approached the hurdle, Shadow hesitated, his muscles twitching as if he were unsure whether he could even attempt it. He faltered just before the wooden poles, his body tensing. Jacob's hand was still firm on the lead rope, guiding him forward. "Come on, buddy," Jacob whispered, his voice calm, urging the horse forward. "You can do this. We're in this together." Shadow stepped back, pulling slightly against the lead. Jacob paused, feeling his chest tighten. He could hear Braden snickering from the sidelines, the sound of it digging into him like an old wound. But this wasn't about Braden. This wasn't even about the hurdle. This was about proving to himself and to Shadow that they could face the fear that had held them both back. "Again," Jacob said, his voice steady, though his pulse was quickening. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. This time, when Jacob led Shadow toward the hurdle, he kept the pace slower, more deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't forcing the horse. He was guiding him. Every step forward was a victory in itself. As they neared the hurdle, Shadow hesitated once more, but this time Jacob could feel the shift. The stallion's body relaxed, just a little, as if understanding that this was not a fight. It wasn't an obstacle. It was just another step. With a sharp intake of breath, Jacob pulled lightly on the rope and gave a soft command. Shadow surged forward. The horse's front legs came up, his body tensing, his muscles straining as he cleared the hurdle. Barely. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't pretty. But it was enough. For the first time, Jacob allowed himself to smile. He couldn't help it. His heart was racing, but there was a sense of pride that surged through him, like a floodgate opening. He had done it. They had done it. Braden's laughter stopped. The smug look on his face faltered as he watched Shadow land awkwardly but firmly on the other side of the hurdle. There was no denying it now. Jacob had proven him wrong. "Not bad, Disney boy," Braden muttered. But there was no conviction in his voice anymore. He was trying to mask the surprise, the shock that had just cracked through his armor. For a moment, the words didn't matter. Jacob had done what everyone said he couldn't. Jacob looked at Braden, but he didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He didn't need Braden's approval. He didn't need anyone's. The only thing that mattered was the horse standing beside him, the one who had once been broken, the one who had learned to trust again. "Shadow, you did it," Jacob whispered, his voice full of admiration. He leaned forward and gently rubbed the horse's neck. The bond between them felt unbreakable now. They had faced their demons together, both of them broken in different ways, yet still standing strong. Braden, still standing by the fence, crossed his arms and stared at Jacob, his lips pressed in a thin line. The cocky attitude was gone, replaced by something closer to begrudging respect. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The challenge had been set, and Jacob had won. As Jacob turned to Shadow, he couldn't help but feel that they had crossed an invisible line, one that marked not just a victory over Braden, but a victory over everything that had held them back. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were moving forward. The hurdle had been cleared, and now nothing felt impossible. The days that followed were a blur of sweat, dirt, and quiet determination. Jacob had spent years on a dirt bike, learning to ride with precision, to jump with instinct. But training Shadow was something else entirely. It wasn't about speed or reflex. It was about trust, about understanding, about learning to work together as if their bodies and minds were one. Jacob wasn't a professional horse trainer. He didn't have any fancy equipment, no fancy methods, and certainly no second person to help. But what he did have was time, patience, and a determination that burned inside of him. And now, with Shadow, it wasn't just about proving Braden wrong. It was about proving to himself that he could still be the person he wanted to be, someone who could rise above the things that had tried to break him. Every morning, Jacob would wake before sunrise, the air still cool with the remnants of the night. Shadow would already be waiting, standing by the fence, his eyes locked on Jacob's every movement. Jacob didn't need to be told that the horse was ready. Shadow had already decided that he trusted him enough to try, even if he wasn't sure of what would come next. Jacob would lead Shadow into the training area, a simple stretch of dirt behind the barn. There were no obstacles, no fancy hurdles or challenging equipment, just space for them to work together, to learn. The first thing Jacob focused on was teaching Shadow to walk calmly by his side. The horse's pace was erratic at first, jerky and uncertain, like the first steps of a baby learning to walk. But Jacob stayed calm, his hand on the lead rope, his voice low and steady. "Easy, buddy. It's okay. Just follow me." At first, Shadow would pull, his body tensing, his legs rushing forward. Jacob would pause, gently pulling the lead rope to slow the horse down, letting him feel the control, but never forcing it. Slowly, as the days passed, the frantic pace became more deliberate. Shadow learned to match Jacob's movements, stepping in sync with his new trainer. There were times when the horse would flinch or pull away, but Jacob never lost his patience. He stayed steady, guiding Shadow with his voice, with soft touches, with encouragement. It was hard. More than once, Jacob felt his arm strain as he held it into the rope with just one hand, balancing the weight of his own body while trying to maintain control over the powerful horse beside him. But Jacob wasn't about to give up. He couldn't. Not now. Not when they were this close. The sun climbed higher, and with each passing day, Shadow seemed to become more comfortable with the routine. His steps grew more measured, his pace slower but steady. Jacob wasn't just training a horse. He was reteaching himself how to believe again. Every time Shadow responded, every time he learned to trust Jacob a little more, Jacob felt a small piece of his old self coming back. The training wasn't just physical. Jacob spent hours simply sitting with Shadow, reading out loud, speaking softly to him, and teaching him to be comfortable with the sound of Jacob's voice. He knew it wasn't just the horse who was learning to trust. It was him, too. One morning, as Jacob worked with Shadow on simple commands, Braden showed up, early as usual, arms crossed and a look of annoyance on his face. Jacob could feel his cousin's eyes watching them, but he didn't let it distract him. Not this time. Braden's voice cut through the quiet, dripping with sarcasm. "Well, well, Disney boy, you really think that horse is going to get anywhere, huh? He's barely walking in a straight line." Jacob didn't respond. Instead, he focused on Shadow, giving a soft click of his tongue and pulling the lead rope gently. "Come on, buddy. Let's go," Jacob murmured, urging the horse forward. For the next few minutes, Jacob and Shadow worked through the motions, turning in small circles, walking in a straight line, and halting when told. It wasn't perfect, not by any means. Shadow's movements were still stiff, and there were moments when the horse seemed uncertain, unsure of what Jacob wanted. But with every step, Jacob could feel the horse's confidence growing. The tension in his muscles loosened, his movements becoming more fluid, more natural. Braden wasn't impressed, of course. He stood there, arms crossed, shaking his head with a scoff. "Yeah, right. You're really going to teach him to jump now?" Braden said, his voice mocking. "You're wasting your time. He's just not built for it. You're just not built for it." Jacob kept his eyes on Shadow, his focus unbroken. "I'm not doing this for you, Braden," Jacob said quietly, his voice full of determination. "I'm doing this for us." Braden sneered, but didn't say anything else. He was used to Jacob staying quiet, used to getting under his skin with taunts. But today was different. Jacob didn't need Braden's approval. He had something better. He had Shadow. For the next several days, Jacob and Shadow worked harder than ever. They practiced turns, stops, and starts. Shadow learned to follow Jacob's lead, to move with him rather than against him. Each time Shadow made progress, Jacob felt his heart swell with pride. They were getting somewhere. They were becoming a team. Jacob's training wasn't just about the physical motions, it was about learning to communicate without words, to understand one another on a deeper level. He didn't need to force Shadow to jump. They would do it together, when the time was right. They would do it when they were ready. And then, on the 8th day of their training, Jacob decided it was time to try again. He led Shadow up to the makeshift hurdle. Nothing fancy, just a low wooden bar. Shadow hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the obstacle, but Jacob stayed calm. He had worked with Shadow every day, every step leading up to this moment. He pulled the lead rope gently, guiding the horse forward. Shadow's hooves moved with purpose now. His steps were no longer hesitant. They were confident. And when they reached the hurdle, Jacob urged him on with a soft, "Come on, buddy." This time Shadow didn't hesitate. His muscles tensed and his body gathered itself, and then with a powerful push, he leaped over the hurdle. Not gracefully, not flawlessly, but he cleared it. Jacob's heart raced and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had done it. They had done it. They weren't perfect, but they had proven something bigger than just the jump. They had proven that they could work together. They could overcome their fears. Braden's voice from the fence was quiet now. Nothing more than a distant murmur. But Jacob didn't care anymore. He didn't need to hear Braden's approval. What mattered was that Shadow had made it. And Jacob had made it with him. Jacob's smile was the widest it had been in weeks. He didn't just smile at the jump. He smiled at what it represented, the beginning of something new. A partnership, a trust, and for the first time in a long while, Jacob felt like he wasn't broken anymore. The day had finally come. Jacob stood at the edge of the makeshift training area, his gaze fixed on the low wooden hurdle in front of him. The early morning sun bathed the yard in a soft golden light, and there was a quiet sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Jacob's heart beat faster, but it wasn't the same frantic rhythm of nervousness. No, this time it was steady, calm, filled with the quiet strength he had built over the past weeks. Beside him, Shadow stood tall, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes wide but focused. The stallion was more confident now, his movements smoother, his body less tense. They had come so far together, each step forward, each breakthrough, each moment of trust had led them here. It wasn't about proving anything to Braden anymore. It wasn't about the bet or the mockery. It was about showing themselves that they could face what they once thought was impossible. Jacob's hands tightened around the lead rope, feeling the familiar strength of Shadow at his side. They were ready. They had trained for this moment, and despite the obstacles, the setbacks, and the doubts, they had made it to this point. All that was left was the jump. Braden stood by the fence, arms crossed, his usual smirk still in place. He hadn't said much lately, but Jacob could see the skepticism still lurking in his eyes. Braden had never believed in second chances, not for people or animals. He was waiting for Jacob to fail, waiting for the moment when Shadow would fall short, just like everyone had predicted. But Jacob wasn't thinking about Braden anymore. He wasn't even thinking about the hurdle itself. His focus was on Shadow, on the quiet strength that had been building between them, and on the trust they had forged together. "All right, buddy," Jacob said softly, his voice steady but full of resolve. "We've got this." Shadow's ears flicked in response, his body still but tense with the same unspoken anticipation that filled the air around them. For a brief moment Jacob hesitated, his heart pounding as he considered everything that had led up to this moment. The accident, the feeling of being broken, the doubts, the endless struggle to find purpose again. But in that moment, standing with Shadow, Jacob knew that none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the leap. What mattered was the trust they had built and the faith they had in each other. Jacob gave a gentle tug on the lead rope, guiding Shadow forward toward the hurdle. The horse's hooves scraped against the dirt, his body moving with purpose, yet his muscles still felt the weight of uncertainty. But Jacob didn't let go. He kept his hands steady, his voice calm. "Come on, Shadow," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "We've done the hard part. Now we finish it." As they neared the hurdle, Jacob felt a surge of emotion in his chest. The horse's steps quickened and Jacob's heart skipped a beat. Shadow was moving with him now. No hesitation, no fear. He was trusting Jacob completely, just as Jacob had learned to trust him. The moment before, the jump felt like an eternity. Time seemed to slow down as the two of them approached the low wooden bar. For a split second, Jacob thought about everything that had led up to this moment. The pain, the loneliness, the doubts. And then, just as quickly, all those thoughts were gone. There was only Shadow, only the bond they had built together. And then, in one fluid motion, Shadow's body surged forward. His hooves lifted off the ground, his muscles coiling and propelling him toward the hurdle. Jacob held his breath, feeling the tension in the air. For a moment, it seemed like time had stopped altogether. Shadow's front legs cleared the bar with a powerful thrust, his body following in a graceful arc. He was airborne for just a second, but in that second, Jacob felt it. The connection. The moment of perfect harmony between them. And then, with a soft thud, Shadow's hooves landed on the ground on the other side of the hurdle, his body steady and balanced. Jacob let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. The jump had been nothing spectacular. It hadn't been a perfect leap, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they had done it. Together. For a long moment, neither Jacob nor Shadow moved. Jacob stood there, his eyes locked on the horse, his heart still racing. There was a quiet sense of triumph in the air, but it wasn't the kind of victory that came from beating someone else. It was the kind of victory that came from within, from pushing past the doubt, from overcoming the fear, from proving to themselves that they were capable of more than anyone had ever believed. Braden's voice cut through the silence. His tone was different now, quieter, less mocking. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, his arms still crossed, but no longer with the same sense of superiority. "You actually did it." Jacob didn't respond. He didn't need to. He didn't need Braden's approval. Not anymore. The victory wasn't for anyone but him and Shadow. It wasn't about proving something to a person who had doubted him. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't broken, that he and Shadow weren't broken. Jacob turned to Shadow, his smile widening. "You did it, buddy," he whispered, reaching out to pat the horse's neck. "We did it." Shadow nickered softly, his ears flicking back in what Jacob could only interpret as a kind of quiet satisfaction. For the first time since they had met, Jacob felt that the horse wasn't just following him, he was with him. The bond had been formed not through force, but through patience, trust, and understanding. Braden's footsteps were the only sound as he walked away from the fence, muttering something under his breath. But Jacob didn't pay him any more attention. The challenge was over. The bet had been won. But the real victory, the one that mattered, was the journey he and Shadow had taken together. The jump was just the beginning. Jacob stood there for a moment longer, taking in the peaceful silence of the yard. The sun was higher in the sky now, and everything felt right. For the first time in months, Jacob felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Right here, with Shadow. Together, they had jumped over more than just a physical barrier. They had jumped over their doubts, their fears, and the pain of their past. And the best part was, they weren't done yet. The wind had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, but the air felt lighter somehow. The weight of the past few weeks, the struggle, the doubt, the fear, it had all dissipated in the wake of the jump. Jacob stood still for a moment, his eyes locked on Shadow, who stood in front of him, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The horse's muscles were still tense, but the look in his eyes had changed. There was something softer there now. A recognition, a sense of connection that hadn't been there before. Jacob let out a breath, a smile spreading across his face. He reached out to gently pat Shadow's neck, his fingers running through the soft coat. The horse's ears flicked, and for a brief second Jacob could almost swear that Shadow leaned into the touch. It was a small thing, but to Jacob it meant everything. "Well, well," Braden's voice broke the silence. "I'll give you this, Disney boy." "I didn't think you had it in you." Jacob didn't turn to look at Braden. He didn't need to. The words weren't as harsh as they used to be, and that was enough. Braden was standing by the fence, arms crossed, his face wearing an expression of begrudging respect. The cocky attitude was gone, replaced by something more complicated, something Jacob couldn't quite define. But he didn't care. Jacob's smile remained. He didn't need Braden's validation, not anymore. He gave Shadow another pat, stepping back slightly to assess the horse. They'd done it. They'd proven something to themselves. The moment had been cathartic, not just because they had cleared the hurdle, but because it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. This was no longer just about the jump. It was about reclaiming what had been lost. The stillness was broken by the sound of a truck rumbling down the dirt road. Jacob's gaze lifted, his mind momentarily distracted. A familiar red pickup came into view, its engine roaring in the distance, growing louder by the second. Jacob recognized the truck immediately. It was the town vet, a kind woman named Sarah, who had helped his aunt with the animals on the farm for years. Sarah had always been kind, even when Jacob's parents had passed and he had fallen into himself, retreating into the corners of his mind. The truck rolled to a stop in front of the barn, and Sarah hopped out, her boots kicking up the dust as she made her way over to Jacob and Shadow. She was in her mid-30s, with short-cropped brown hair and a practical but friendly demeanor. Her eyes softened when she saw Shadow, and she gave Jacob a warm smile. "Well, I'll be damned," Sarah said, looking from Jacob to Shadow and back again. "I've been hearing about the progress you two have made, but I didn't think I'd see it for myself." Jacob didn't say anything at first. He just smiled, the pride in his chest swelling again. Sarah was one of the few people who had always been patient with him, even when he didn't know how to be patient with himself. Sarah crouched down to Shadow's level, her hand outstretched in a slow, non-threatening manner. Shadow took a cautious step back, but Sarah didn't move. She kept her hand open, palm up, letting the horse decide when he was ready. Jacob watched as Shadow's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to him, and finally, slowly, the horse took a tentative step forward. "Look at that," Sarah whispered with a smile. "You two are something else." Jacob's smile deepened. It was the first time someone had said something like that. And it wasn't just about the jump or the training. It was about the way Sarah had seen them, not as a broken boy and a damaged horse, but as two creatures who had found something in each other. Sarah stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I think it's time we take this to the next level, Jacob. You've done an incredible job with him, but it's not enough just to show up for the hurdle. You've got something special here, and I'd like to help you take it further." Jacob's heart raced. He didn't know what Sarah meant, but the idea of taking things further, of doing more with Shadow, made his chest tighten with hope. Maybe it was time to finally get back on track. Maybe it was time for him to reclaim his place in the world, not as the kid who lost everything, but as someone who had found a way to move forward. "What do you mean?" Jacob asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. I mean," Sarah said, stepping closer and resting a hand on the fence. "You've got talent, both of you. It's not just about this farm. It's about what you can do with Shadow, the potential you're tapping into. I'd like to help you train him. I'd even be willing to help sponsor you to start training professionally. If that's something you want, of course." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. A sponsor? Training professionally? It felt too big, too far out of reach. But looking at Shadow, Feeling the bond they had, he realized it wasn't so impossible. Maybe this was the way forward. Maybe this was his chance to do something more, to be something more. I don't know what to say, Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. I never thought this would be possible. Sarah smiled. It's not just about jumping hurdles, Jacob. It's about the bond you formed with him. That's the foundation. Everything else will come with time. Jacob turned back to Shadow, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. They had done it. They had moved past the pain, the self-doubt, and the loneliness. They had found each other. And maybe, just maybe, they had found a new path forward. For the first time in months, Jacob felt something shift inside him, a sense of possibility. It wasn't just about healing from the accident or proving Braden wrong. It was about finding a new purpose, one that he could share with the horse that had become his partner in ways no one else could understand. I'll think about it, Jacob said finally, turning back to Sarah with a smile. But I think I'd like to give it a shot. Sarah's grin widened. I'll be here when you're ready. As Sarah headed back to her truck, Jacob stood by the paddock, his heart filled with a new kind of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt like he had a direction. He wasn't just moving forward. He was moving towards something. And with Shadow by his side, Jacob knew they were ready for whatever came next. The sun had already begun to set by the time Jacob climbed onto the back of the fence, his legs dangling over the wooden posts. The evening air was cool, and the golden light from the sinking sun bathed the farm in a soft amber hue. It was the kind of quiet that seemed to stretch out forever, a moment suspended in time that Jacob wasn't sure he deserved, but was willing to embrace. Beside him, Shadow stood, his head grazing the long grasses along the fence line. The horse's coat still shimmered in the low light, the muscles of his back moving with a fluid grace that Jacob hadn't seen in the early days of their bond. It had taken time, patience, trust, but the two of them had come a long way, not just in terms of training, but in understanding each other. Jacob looked down at Shadow, his fingers running through the long, windswept hair of his horse's mane. The bond they shared had grown stronger than any words could explain. Shadow wasn't just a horse to him anymore. He was a partner, a companion, a silent ally who had stood by him when the world had turned its back. Jacob had found in Shadow not just a way to heal his own brokenness, but a path toward a future he never thought possible. The road had been hard, and there were times when Jacob thought about giving up. There were times when the doubts crept in, the times when Braden's harsh words or the fear of failure would almost be too much to bear. But every time, as he had come back to this moment, the moment when they had cleared the hurdle, when he had felt the bond between them click into place, that was when he knew that the world could say what it wanted about him, but he and Shadow were enough. Jacob wasn't the same boy who had walked into the auction that day, desperate for something to believe in. He wasn't the same boy who had given up on himself after the accident. No, he was someone stronger, someone more determined to prove that just because something is broken doesn't mean it can't be fixed. He glanced over at the barn, the soft light of the setting sun illuminating the rough edges of the building. It wasn't perfect, nothing here was, but it was his. It was their home. And in the stillness of the evening, Jacob realized something. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to be whole, as the world defined it. He just needed to keep going, to keep moving forward, one step at a time. All right, Shadow, Jacob whispered, the words soft and full of understanding. Let's do this. He didn't hesitate. With practiced ease, he swung his leg over the horse's back, settling into the familiar rhythm that had once seemed impossible. At first, Shadow tensed beneath him, but Jacob's hands stayed steady, the pressure of his knees light but firm. He had learned to communicate with Shadow without words, relying on the unspoken connection between them. The first few steps were hesitant, but Jacob didn't mind. He knew this was just another beginning. Another chapter in the story that was still unfolding between them. Shadow moved forward, slow at first, but with each step he grew more confident. Together, they glided across the field, moving with a shared purpose. The sound of their hooves was rhythmic, the crunch of the dirt beneath them. A steady beat that matched the pulse of Jacob's heart. The wind tousled his hair, but he didn't mind. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He wasn't hiding from the world. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt free. Free from the fear of being judged. Free from the expectations of others. He was simply Jacob, riding his horse, living his life. As they moved across the field, Jacob didn't focus on the distance. He didn't focus on where they were going or what they had yet to do. No, he focused on the moment, on the bond they had built, on the quiet understanding between him and the horse who had become his partner, his friend. The barn, the paddock, the whole farm faded into the background. It was just him and Shadow moving through the dusk together, without a care in the world. When they reached the far edge of the field, Jacob eased Shadow into a gentle stop, his heart racing from the sheer exhilaration of the ride. He let out a deep breath and slid off the horse, his legs a little shaky but filled with pride. The moment felt bigger than just a ride. It was a culmination of everything they had been through together, the struggle, the triumph, the quiet moments of connection. Jacob turned and looked at Shadow, who was standing quietly beside him, his head lowered in a peaceful, contented way. For a moment, Jacob just stood there, taking it all in. The setting sun, the horse beside him, and the quiet stillness of the farm. "We did it, buddy," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We made it." Shadow's ears flicked back toward him, and for a brief moment Jacob could almost feel the horse's own sense of contentment. It wasn't about winning a raise or clearing another hurdle. It wasn't about anything external. It was about the shared understanding, the bond that had formed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. As Jacob looked out over the farm, he realized something else. This wasn't just a place where he had found healing. This was a place where he had found himself again. He wasn't the boy who had lost everything. He wasn't the person who had been broken by the world. He was someone who had picked himself up, who had rebuilt himself piece by piece. And in that rebuilding, he had found more than just the boy he once was. He had found the man he was becoming. And Shadow? Shadow had found a new life too. Together, they had healed. Together, they had learned that broken things don't stay broken forever. Not when they find someone who refuses to give up on them. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows over the farm, Jacob gave Shadow one last pat, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. He didn't need to say anything more. They both knew the truth. They had made it, and the journey ahead, no matter where it led, would be theirs to take together.